Most people wouldn't have been able to live in Alaska's harsh, unforgiving wilderness for over 40 years. They've relied on their skills, instincts, and each other to get through some of the worst conditions on Earth. But their journey hasn't just been about strength. It's also been marked by deep heartbreak. Behind the beautiful landscapes and self-sufficient way of life is a story of unimaginable loss. What tragedy almost broke them, and why do they still do it? To fully understand what we're about to find out, we need to go back to the beginning. Heimo and Edna are a rare breed of true off-the-grid survivalists who live deep in Alaska's Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. It's one of the most remote places on Earth, and not many people live there. In fact, the Korths are among the last people to do it the old-fashioned way, relying only on the land to survive. But Heimo Korth wasn't born into this life. He came from Appleton, Wisconsin. The town wasn't huge, but it was bigger than both Fairbanks and Juneau put together at the time. His parents, Eric and Irene, weren't into the outdoors. Even though his dad grew up on a farm, he never learned to hunt, trap, or fish. Instead, he worked in a factory, which offered a steady, predictable life. Heimo tried working in a factory back in Wisconsin, but it wasn't for him. He had always been drawn to the wild. Even as a kid growing up in the suburbs, while other kids ran toward town, he did the opposite. The open fields and woods were waiting to be explored, but he usually went alone because no one else seemed to love them as much as he did. By the time he was a teenager, the pull toward the wilderness was too strong to ignore. In 1973, when he was only 18, he left for Canada's Northwest Territories to follow his dream. It was during the Vietnam War. So many people thought he was avoiding the draft, but he was determined. Make a name for himself in the wild. His first job was as an assistant to a hunting guide, but the pay was so bad that he could barely pay his rent and food. He had to go back to Wisconsin, but the wilderness kept calling him. Then he got a break and a chance to work for a guide who hunted big game in the Brooks Range. He was 20 years old when he left for good and never came back. After working with a hunting guide for a while, he met a friend who ran a trapping line. This friend didn't just give him advice, he also gave him food traps, and everything else he needed. He also flew him out to a cabin in the middle of nowhere where he was alone with the wild for 3 months. It was hard for him to learn how to trap, and he almost went hungry. To make things worse, he lost almost everything when he fell through the ice on the river. He had no way to get back to civilization, so he wrote a letter to his old boss asking for help. To his surprise, his boss sent him a check for $500, which was just enough to get him back to civilization. When he got back to town, he tried to get his bearings, but something changed in him. The wildness had a hold on him, and he knew this was the kind of life he wanted. He spent the rest of that first winter on St. Lawrence Island, a tiny Eskimo village way out in the Bering Sea, just 90 min from Siberia. That's where he met Edna, though they didn't start dating right away. Edna was born on January 25, 1954, and her native name is May Doman. Growing up in the community meant learning how to fish, hunt, and survive off the land. Jackson Muck was great at trapping foxes and taught her how to cut the furs without hurting them and how to take care of them after skinning them. By that time, Heimo had become like family. He was close with Edna's father, Emerson, and spent a lot of time with them. Jackson even took Heimo under his wing and taught him everything he knew about trapping and fur preparation. It wasn't long before Jackson realized that Heimo had a thing for Edna, especially when he joked that Edna was Hal's wife. Little towns make everything public, and he didn't want to be at the center of the gossip. So, Mill Heimo kept himself busy by helping CS run the village store and learning how to hunt from the best in town. When spring came around, he left for Beaver Creek, a river in the White Mountains near Fairbanks, where a friend had a cabin and needed someone to watch their dogs for the summer. Heimo packed up and went back into the wild for the next few months. 2 winters, Heimo was deep in the Brooks Range, a harsh mountain range where survival was anything but easy. In Alaska, they call it hunger country for a reason. There aren't many animals out there, so trapping was hard, food was scarce, and the cold was constant, with deep snow and freezing temperatures every day. He may not have made a lot of money, but those winters made him a true mountain man. He proved that he could not only survive but thrive in one of the harshest places on Earth. Heimo finally found what he was looking for, a place along the Coline River. The Coline River is a smaller branch of the Porcupine River and is tucked away deep in Alaska's wilderness. He needed a place where he could trap enough fur to make a living, but by the time he got there, most of the best trapping grounds around the Yukon Flats were already taken by other trappers. However, his friend Bob had already been trapping there and invited Heimo to join him further up the river, so Heimo hiked about 50 mi upstream, not knowing what to expect. 3 years later, he went back to Songa X to see Edna again, but as soon as he saw her, he realized how lonely he'd been without her all that time. On their first date, they kept things simple but unforgettable. They went fishing for Dolly Varden, took a motorcycle ride, and ended the night with pizza. In the late 1970s, Edna went to Howe's cabin in the mountains for the first time. It was her first time seeing the place he had built, and she fell in love with it. Although she wasn't sure if telling him to start building a real home for her was the right thing to do, she stuck to her word, so he did. He had to finish before winter, so he worked like crazy for a week, and just as the first snowflakes fell, he put the finishing touches on his home. Howe and Edna got married in 1982, and for most of the year they didn't have running water, electricity, or a way to connect with the outside world. Every fall they went hunting. Before she met him, Edna had already been through a lot of heartbreak. She was engaged to a Swedish biologist, and they had 2 children together, Melinda and Merlin. But tragedy struck when her fiancé died in a plane crash, leaving her to raise their children by herself. It was a terrible loss, and being a single mother put a lot of stress on her. Her next relationship didn't bring her much comfort either. Her uncle saw for himself that the next guy she dated wasn't good for her because he cheated on her and wasn't reliable, so when Howe came along, her uncle was cautious. He wanted to be sure that this man was different and would treat Edna right. Howe proved himself by adopting Melinda, even though she only lived with them part of the year. For the rest of the time, she stayed with Edna's parents in Savona, where she felt most at home. Merlin, Edna's son, lived with her parents full-time in Sana. It was common for kids to be raised by grandparents or other relatives, but even though it hurt, Edna knew that her parents could give her kids the stability she couldn't provide in the wilderness. 4 months after they got married, Edna and Heimo had their first daughter, together. They named her Colleen after the Colleen River. Colleen was like a little wildflower. She spent the summers picking blueberries with Edna, splashing in the river with them, and riding on Howe's shoulders. But more than anything else, she was a wildflower. She liked to explore and would often get lost, so Edna sewn a small bell onto her coat to keep track of her. Every night when the family went for walks along the river, the sound of the bell jingling with each step kept her close. She was also very interested in the moon. Whenever it showed up in the sky, Howe would pick her up to see it better, and she would point and call out, "Moo moo!" Then, just 5 days after her second birthday, Colleen drowned in a river accident, and they never found her. Family and friends begged the Korths to leave the bush and start over somewhere else, but they couldn't because this was Colleen's home. Her laughter could still be heard in the wind, and her little footprints were still in the dirt. Leaving would have been like forgetting her. That day, when they got back to their cabin, Howe carved a wooden cross for her, carefully engraving her name and the dates of her short life. That fall, he and Edna carried the cross up a small mountain with a view of the valley and the river, which they put there to remember their love and loss. To honor their daughter, Howe and Edna tried to get the mountain named after her, but the Board of Geographic Names said no. Even though the governor and a congressman supported them, they were told over and over again that Colleen wasn't historically significant enough. They collected signatures and did everything else that was asked of them, but the answer stayed the same. Eventually, they had to give up. But even though they were sad, Howe and Edna wouldn't let it go. Piro once asked if a couple in Dallas lost a child in a car accident, would they move away to get away from the pain? No, because Dallas was their home, and that's how he and Edna felt. Even decades later, they still got emotional when they thought about Colleen. The grief never really went away, but they kept going. They had 2 more daughters, Rhonda and Christy, and they started a family tradition where every once in a while they would make the trip up to. Years went by, but the wilderness stayed their home. Howe was proud of the life they had built by preserving a way of life that had been around for thousands of years. What began as an adventure became just how they lived. In 1992, Heimo Korth's life in the wild caught the attention of the public when he appeared in Braving Alaska, a National Geographic special. At first he wasn't sure about it because he thought the show might make his life in the mountains look bad, but in the end he was happy with it. Taking a chance paid off, and he was pleased with how the documentary turned out. It showed 4 families living in the Alaskan wilderness, and it was a rare chance to see Edna and her children when they were young. Another family shown was the Haydens, who lived on the Hay River. One of their daughters, Susan Hayden, was only a teenager at the time, but she was already running her dog team and trapping. Years later, she and her brother went back to their old home, and Susan even made a few appearances on The Last Alaskans Fast. Years later, in 2003, Howe's cousin James Campbell, a writer, sent him a letter with an idea. He wanted to write a book about Howe's life. At first, Howe wasn't interested, but after some thought, he decided to give Campbell a chance. James made the long trip from Wisconsin to Alaska and spent a whole season living with the Korth family. He felt the harsh cold, the isolation, and the daily struggles of surviving in one of the harshest places on Earth. The Final Frontiersman, a book published in 2004 that told the story of Howe and his family's life in the wild, was a big hit. It was well written, exciting, and full of real-life adventures. In 2009, Vice Media came calling and shot Howe's Arctic Refuge, also known as Surviving Alone in Alaska. A documentary that showed Howe and Edna's life in the wilderness without any editing. It's the kind of movie that makes you care about the people who live in the harsh, beautiful scenery. In 2012, Howe found himself on Flying Wild Alaska by accident. He just wanted a ride to Fairbanks, so he contacted the show's star, who happened to be a pilot. The next thing he knew, he was back on TV, but this time it was a different show. Not until 2015 did Heimo and his family really become well known. That's when The Last Alaskans aired on Animal Planet, following a few families who lived in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, one of the most remote places in the United States. The show showed their struggles and joys. The show had 4 seasons with a total of 36 episodes. By the time it ended in January 2019, it had built a loyal fan base. Viewers were interested in the different families, but Howe and Edna Korth were the heart of it all. They weren't just surviving in the wild, they were thriving. Howe's love for the Alaskan way of life was palpable. It caught on right away in the first show when he said, "This is an adventure." It said that nature guides your path, and that was their truth. Howe reportedly made around $3,000 per episode of The Last Alaskans, but money was never what drove him or Edna. This was the life they had chosen, for better or worse, and the show didn't just show the good times. It also showed the heartbreak, like when they lost their 2-year-old daughter Colleen in a canoeing accident. Most reality shows avoid showing the hard parts, but The Last Alaskans never shied away from the Even though the show was popular, it was expensive to make, which is one reason why it only ran for 4 seasons. What made the last season of Alaskan stand out was how true to life it was. Unlike other Alaska-based reality shows that focused on drama or exaggerated danger, this one was just people living their lives as they always had. Some were born into it and carrying on generations-old traditions, while others moved there looking for solitude and purpose. In 2016, James Campbell, Howe's story was reread, and this time he brought his daughter with him to experience life at Howe's cabin. It was an interesting look at how things had changed, or maybe how they hadn't. Years later, Howe and Edna's 3 daughters, Millie, Rhonda, and Kristen, had all grown up and started their own lives in Fairbanks, far from the remote wilderness where they were raised. But it's clear that the wild still calls to them. Kristen, the youngest, feels that pull the most, and she and her husband are planning to move to Alaska, move closer to her parents, and bring their son Colby with her. Even though they live far away, Howe and Edna's kids and grandchildren still visit their remote cabin, and every summer Howe and Edna go back to Fairbanks to spend time with them. But as soon as fall comes around, they go back to the only life they've ever known, out in the wild. Howe still makes a living the old-fashioned way by riding a snowmobile through the snowy wilderness and running trap lines that run for hundreds of miles. Trappers hunt and catch wolves, wolverines, foxes, martens, and beavers across those vast frozen landscapes. Beaver meat is tasty and their fur is valuable. Harrow is known as one of the best wolverine trappers in North America. Edna also traps, but she stays closer to home to focus on the basics. She still makes their winter gear by hand, like Howe's heavy-duty parka and the thick gloves that keep him warm. The years are flying by, and being so far away from their family isn't always easy, but when winter comes, Hao and Edna always go back to the cabin. They feel like that land and life are in their blood. Hao, who is still strong and full of energy, says he wants to spend the rest of his days out there in the only place that's ever felt like home.